Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for August 31st, 2021. Well, we can finally say it. America's longest war is over. The last troops pulled out, the last planes left the Hamid Karzai International Airport. The adventure in Afghanistan, or I should say the misadventure in Afghanistan, is finally ended. Now, Tony Blinken, who I rarely agree with, but he made a statement yesterday which I think is important for people to think about. He said, "The military mission is over, a new diplomatic mission begins." Now, what is that diplomatic mission? That's the main issue. And what I'm going to do is summarize some comments made by Helga Zepp-LaRouche yesterday, following a weekend of discussion and a longer statement from her, but she got to the point of really summarizing what needs to be done. Many of you know we've had a series of conferences, including 2 on Afghanistan, where we've presented the alternative to war, which is starting from the standpoint that there's no military solution to what we faced in Afghanistan, but there is a diplomatic economic cooperation which could reverse the collapse of the system, of which Afghanistan is a perfect example, what happened in Afghanistan. Now, you cannot judge the pullout of Afghanistan from the standpoint of an individual event, a single occurrence. Look at it in isolation. It represents the end of an era, the collapse of a system, which was part of what was installed after the assassination of John F. Kennedy, after the end of the Bretton Woods system in 1971, after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989-1990, after the terror attack of 2001, and after the financial blowout of 2007-2008. All of those events are part of a reaction or part of something that was caused by what changed in our nation's policy following the murder of John F. Kennedy, which was that the United States became totally a puppet of a geopolitical doctrine run by London on behalf of the City of London banks, with Wall Street as a partner, which believed in the idea, ultimately, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, of a unipolar world order, that there's only one nation with the power to dictate policy. The policies came from London, but they were enforced by the U.S. military and those people in the United States who were educated in London, who agreed with the idea of geopolitics, the ideas underlying geopolitics and the neoliberal system. And so what we saw in Afghanistan was not a military failure. The military did their job in 2001. It was not a political failure in 2021. It's a cumulative effect of a wrong policy over minimally 20 years in Afghanistan, but actually over an arc of 50 years going back to 1971. This should be the end of endless wars that are fought on false grounds, that are developed, are justified by narratives which are supposedly we're going in to protect the people whose nation we're destroying militarily. It's not the fault of the military, that's the job they had given to them. But there was no way to win a military victory over the last 20 years. And those people who say we should have stayed longer or we botched the pullout, the longer we stayed, the more there would be terrorism. The more we would be subjecting our men and women in uniform to terror. You don't think that's the case? Look at this very simple argument. Al-Qaeda and ISIS are still in Afghanistan. We were there for 20 years with part of our mission to wipe them out. I heard Martha McCallum on Fox News this morning say that isn't it terrible that with 9/11 coming up, we've now given Afghanistan to the people who were behind 9/11. Well, that's simply wrong. Afghanistan was not behind 9/11. It was the Saudis. It was covered up what actually happened on 9/11 by the FBI. The family members of the victims of 9/11 are suing the U.S. government to get the documents hidden by the FBI which show the Saudi role in 9/11. So this is what I mean by false equivalency and fallacy of composition. The roots of the Afghan crisis have very little to do with Afghanistan and have a lot to do with a British doctrine that goes back to the Great Game in the middle of the 18th century, and in which the United States became one of the players, beginning with Brzezinski in the late 1970s. So what this means is don't blame the military, blame the policy of regime change, of color revolution, of the U.S. providing the military muscle for a City of London policy, of unipolar control of the world economy, and punishing any nation which refuses to accept the policies of London, and by extension, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and the global central banks. So the root of the problem is the collapse of that system. It's been collapsing in slow motion for 50 years, and it's speeding up now. Now, what Helga Zepp-LaRouche said is that the problem in the West, which gets to this question of what is the mission now, is that most have not grasped the significance of this point, that it's the system that failed. The system of globalization has failed. It lies in ruin in the bombed-out villages of Afghanistan, in the destroyed cities of Iraq and Syria, in the refugee camps filled with hungry and terrified children throughout Southwest Asia. That's the system that failed. And what's needed is not just sacks of humanitarian aid, some rice, some powdered milk, some bread. That's needed. But what's really needed is a full economic development policy to build new platforms of infrastructure, which are less costly by far than new wars. We need to help people and help the government in Afghanistan, even if it is the Taliban. Offer a hand. We'll help you build a health system, help you with electric power, help you with water management, and so on. If you work with the rest of the world, that's the approach that the Schiller Institute has presented in our two recent conferences, July 31st and then August 21st, I believe. The two conferences where we discussed how to engage with the neighbors of Afghanistan and with other nations, including India, Russia, and China, in a reconstruction project, a development project. What happens if there's no economic development? Well, suppose you evacuated another 50,000 people from Afghanistan. You still have 30 million people there. What happens to them? If there's no income, if there's no economy, because of the retribution dished out by the International Monetary Fund and the international banks, which are withholding Afghanistan's actual money that's in U.S. and Western banks, and the IMF, which is withholding the special drawing rights that they need to purchase emergency supplies. If you withhold that because you don't like the Taliban, what does that do? That creates an incentive for them to go back to opium production, to not work with us to stamp out terrorism. And it creates a situation of impoverishment and civil war in Afghanistan. So the diplomatic mission is economic development. Development is the name of peace. And if we learn the lesson that, stop focusing on this or that singular event, the event to focus on is a 50-year collapse of the American system, a 50-year retreat into a foreign policy that's based on war and confrontation with other nations. That it's a diplomatic policy which doesn't look for common interests, but tries to highlight the violations of the so-called rules-based order, which is not a rules-based order. It's a phony, hypocritical excuse for Western military power to impose financial corruption, fraud, and looting on the poorer countries of the world, and now they're doing that on the Western countries as well. So let's take this opportunity to junk this system. Study what was wrong with it. Go to the LaRouchePub.com. We've got plenty of documents which will give you background. The LaRouche Legacy Foundation is publishing the works of Lyndon LaRouche. and we're setting up a LaRouche digital library. So you can see what Lyndon LaRouche said over these 50 years about what the problems were and what the solutions are. But for the sake of mankind, we have to reject this British or Anglo-American unipolar policy. Now, I just want to bring up a personal note. You can see over my shoulder a photo of me with Ed Asner, who passed away a couple of days ago, after he did a performance of the one-man show FDR, which was a powerful drama about how FDR overcame polio, organized the coming out of the Great Depression, and was a wartime leader. Ed Asner was a very interesting person, a loving man, a civil rights activist, a fighter for human rights and justice. And while many people don't know this, was a friend of the LaRouche movement and a personal friend of Lyndon LaRouche. I was there on several occasions where he met with LaRouche. There was an effort by a journalist to get Asner to denounce LaRouche because LaRouche had been sent to prison unjustly by the George Herbert Walker Bush administration. And this reporter ambushed him at a LaRouche meeting and said, well, how do you justify being here with LaRouche? And he said, well, I kind of like what he says. I was very interested in what he said tonight. And then the reporter said, but you know he was sent to prison. And Asner said, that makes me more interested in what he said that got him sent to prison. That's the kind of courage and boldness that we need from Hollywood, not the rock, sex, drug counterculture which dominates today. So that's my report for today. By the way, I do have an obituary to add up on my website, which you can take a look at on the LaRoucheorganization.com. I'll see you tomorrow.